From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, I hope you will. Please do so at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave us a nice review. This week, is free speech returning to America's campuses? 2 weeks into the second Trump administration, it's clear that the Republican president is determined to roll back much of the takeover of our major institutions by a progressive elite that has dominated them for decades. He's launched an assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion in government and indeed in wider society. He's making efforts to make the federal bureaucracy more accountable and perhaps look a little bit more like the American people. But all this comes after a few very turbulent years in which the degree of intolerant left-wing extremism on our university campuses in particular has been very much in focus. We've seen pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic demonstrations across the country at some of our leading educational institutions. And of course, cancel culture continues to dominate, where an intolerant and authoritarian left-wing administration and faculty in so many universities refuses to accept alternative views or let other people speak. So, with the new administration in place and an apparent vibe shift sweeping through the country, is it possible that universities may, after all this time, be starting to change too? Well, this week I'm joined by our old friend Paul Alivisatos, president of the University of Chicago. Chicago's been at the forefront of free speech efforts for many years, and Paul's a staunch advocate of the so-called Chicago principles that lay out the basis for a tolerant and open discussion of ideas on university campuses. Of course, as well as being the head of one of our most prestigious universities, Paul is a distinguished academic chemist. I sat down with him recently to review the state of free expression in higher education and to talk about some of the other things that are going on at Chicago and elsewhere in our universities. Paul, thanks very much for joining Free Expression again.
Gerry, it is a joy to be with you again. Let's dig in.
Let's start off with the inevitable, almost perennial subject of the state of speech, free expression, the state of our universities, and perhaps more broadly the state of, if you like, the breadth of ideological opinion in our universities. When we last talked about a year ago, I've explained that as the president of Chicago, you have the Chicago principles, which Chicago adheres to. We spoke a year or so ago. You gave a very clear and very adamant defense of those principles at a time when other universities, perhaps we see other great universities in this country and even elsewhere, maybe are continuing to, behave in ways that put constraints on free speech. How do you see that whole issue going? I mean, you can talk a little bit about obviously what's going on at Chicago again, but more broadly in higher education, what's the state now? Is free expression moving in the right direction?
I think free expression is moving more, if you like, forgive me for saying it this way, a little bit moving more our way in terms of the Chicago principles. Our society, in this world where technology is moving so fast and where geopolitics is changing, our society needs institutions of truth-seeking. And free expression is the foundation of being a truth-seeking institution. It means you're interested in hearing points of view that may not be your own, and that you're going to allow dissenting views, but you're going to have a rich conversation, hopefully in a university, a rigorous, quantitative, serious one, and you're going to try and seek truth. And the Chicago principles are a guide, really, I think, the best guide that's out there for how to be an institution of truth-seeking.
We'll talk a little bit more about the Chicago principles as we've done in the past and about how broad they are, and arguably maybe some people may even argue too broad. But let's talk about what's happening with these other universities. There clearly has been, in the last year, 18 months, especially since the pro-Hamas protests on many university campuses, a backlash, particularly by donors, many wealthy donors who are big contributors to universities like Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. We've seen these cases, and that has resulted directly or indirectly in the resignation of a couple of university presidents, and a general sense that, yes, universities are being sort of encouraged, exactly as you put it very well, to move our way and get their house in order a little bit and allow more expression. And yet the impression I still get on campuses themselves, in faculties on campuses, is that there is still very little diversity of thought. And isn't that diversity of thought in the university faculty, in the university environment, isn't that really a precursor to actually really allowing people to express opinions that veer from the prevailing orthodoxies?
So I think that diversity of thought, which is also related indirectly but not inconsequentially with diversity of experience, but diversity of thought is foundational to being a truth-seeking place. So you're exactly right about that. And I will say that one of the key points about the Chicago principles is institutional neutrality. And if you have an institution which either at the level of presidents or deans or department chairs over and over takes certain positions, then whatever diversity of thought might exist inside the university gets boxed in. And if that happens for a long time, people get very cautious about saying what they really think. And the more that happens, the more it narrows. So now if you suddenly say, well, okay, free expression, we're not going to make statements on, that doesn't mean that overnight suddenly the place becomes completely an open place of inquiry. So I think that's a starting point that's fundamental. I know, Gerry, it's probably what's in the back of your mind is from the get-go, are people already oriented towards particular political viewpoints and that's too narrow? Yeah, I understand that question. I do want to say that we never ask the question, and we should never ask the question, what's your political orientation as you're coming into our faculty, right? That's not our role. But what you should expect from people as they're entering into the faculty is that they really care about genuine answers, that they use facts and evidence to make their cases, and that their minds are open, and that they've changed their minds perhaps. Maybe they've had an experience where they had one point of view and they ended up realizing that they had to take another. I think people's confidence that truth-seeking is really going on will be enhanced if the kind of mechanics follow the principles consistently. And also, I think you'd find that people are going to take broader ranges of points of view. So this is, again, a culture that's created, and I do believe that at Chicago, overwhelmingly, I'm not going to say universally, but overwhelmingly, that's the approach which I see people taking.
Are you confident that at Chicago, and particularly we're talking here about the humanities, the sort of liberal arts parts of the faculty, are you confident that even at Chicago, which again, we in all kinds of ways, as we know, and especially, somebody growing up like me who studied economics, the Chicago School of Economics was extremely important in the sort of what we might call politically the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 1970s and 80s. So there's no question that there has been traditional diversity of thought in that particular area at Chicago. But as you look at Chicago now and you have liberal arts faculty, you have these liberal humanities disciplines, are you confident that as they are hiring, whether it's, postdoctoral fellows, whether it's professorships, that they are genuinely intellectually diverse, in their hiring practices, that if you have views on this topic of, I don't know, let's say gender or something like that, what might be termed more traditional views about historical studies. There's nothing wrong with studying history in the traditional way that it's been taught, the history that most of us grew up with, rather than this modern critical theory and everything else you see. Are you confident that at Chicago, in those faculties in particular, they are open to hiring people who have views that challenge these prevailing ideas on race and gender and sexuality and things like that?
So when we're hiring somebody, I can tell you some things that we don't do. For example, we have never asked for diversity statements or for people to kind of do that type of thing because it's just a wrong-headed policy, and we just never went down that road. And the academy itself, like, for example, you mentioned economics, you've got law, you've got the philosophy department. There are many different parts of the university, and I think they all will be stronger when they're very open and thoughtful about things. You can go all the way back in 1900 in his famous speech, Free Expression in the University, William Rennie Harper said, what happens if we have somebody that is either making a fool of themselves or saying things that are completely absurd and so on? Does that mean that I should go in and zap them? And he said, no, I can't be doing that, but I'll have to forever live with the appointment that I just made. And my reputation as a university rides on being a place that consistently brings in the best people.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ethos we bring, but it's a big faculty. There's lots of different points of view.
Are there lots of different points of view?
I think so, yes. I do think so.
And again, I can't say this about Chicago, so to be fair or not, but I hear from a lot of friends in the academy who say, if you're proposing to do a doctoral dissertation, let's say in the field of history on something pretty traditional, like there's not much original space for research in areas like this, but I don't know, on the founding fathers or something like that of the United States of America, against someone proposing to do a doctoral dissertation on the exploitation of Africans in West Africa by white colonists, your chances of getting the former approved for a dissertation against the latter are infinitesimally small. Is that?
I don't know. Okay, so look, that's a fair question. I can say, for example, just not too long ago, I met with a law professor. I was so happy to meet her. She had just published a book about the period between 1812 and the Civil War and was reflecting on how did the institutions of the United States evolve during that period. I wasn't thinking that was going to come up in this conversation. I can't remember the title of her book, but I was just stunned by it and thinking, yes, that's a real UChicago kind of deal because that period has been largely neglected for many different reasons, or at least in terms of how institution building worked. And what she showed, for example, was that there were many instances where principles and institutions had been kind of run roughshod over because people were trying to achieve certain goals and they didn't care, how some of that had to be corrected later on and so on. It was a fascinating history. I'm very proud of us being the university where that happened. Universities are very, very complex places. There's lots of different points of view. When I first became president, I visited every single department in the university. And I went from breakfast through dinner. And all I can tell you is that as a citizen and as a human being, I came away amazed at what a great research university is like in terms of the range of thought that goes on. Sure, there could be some parts of the university that will go off on excursions and then correct themselves over time. And remember, universities play a long game. They're not there for this year. They're there for, a long time. And so, there's movements and patterns inside different parts of the university. But I do feel like our place cares about knowledge deeply. So I hope that's right overwhelmingly, and that's my experience for the most part. I can't say universally, but enough.
What's your sense of the views of current students, undergraduates particularly, but maybe, postgraduate students too? Obviously, we're going through a time of extraordinary political turbulence. We've just had an election, re-election of Donald Trump, with all the MAGA movement, if you like, that represents. Did very well among a lot of young voters. What we also know is that he tended to do much less well among university graduates than he did among the non-college graduates. On these issues particularly, I don't mean on their broad political issues, I mean on these issues of free speech and free expression and being able to have views that challenge the sort of liberal orthodoxy. Do you get any sense that students are becoming sort of maybe a little more tolerant, a little more open to alternative views?
Our students come to us in the first place because they know about our free expression and because they want the core curriculum. They want to learn how to think in all the different ways, and they want that. And that doesn't mean that they come from a particular political orientation. It just means that they actually want to be involved in ideas and debate. So I see that overwhelmingly amongst our students. But to answer your question more broadly, if I'm off and about, I think this is a time where there's a lot of people really thinking deeply about all of the issues related to free expression that you're talking about in ways that we should see. Because we did have a narrowing of the scope of ideas, broadly speaking, and that occurred in many sectors of society, including higher education. And I think in some critical areas we saw moving away from free expression. And, if there's one thing I do want to try to add in this conversation at some point, Gerry, it's about how universities are one kind of institution of truth-seeking, but there are others that our society depends upon, and they should all take a look at the Chicago principles because it could really help them.
As a matter of interest, what was the reaction on campus when Donald Trump won the election in November? We hear again about some places where students demand safe spaces or a day off for mourning and all that kind of stuff. You did any of that?
Just moved along.
Just went along.
I mean, look, went along. Obviously, people must have voted. They must have had strong opinions and so on.
Sure.
It was a regular...
What
happened at the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we didn't have any safe spaces at the Wall Street Journal. As far as I'm aware. But,
no, but I'm saying there wasn't anything special that day.
But I'm wondering if that has changed. I mean, I think you were there in 2020, but I'm not sure if maybe were you there in 2016? No, you weren't. Okay. Again, it's just whether or not people are becoming slightly more, shall we say, mature about these issues. That's a rather value-loaded term.
I think overwhelmingly in society at large, and yes, I wasn't at Chicago at the 2020 election. I came shortly after.
Yeah. Just quickly, I know I want to move on to some of these fascinating topics of research that we want to talk about, but you mentioned institutional neutrality.
Yeah.
And again, that's been something that's become quite a big thing in the last year. A number of universities have now adopted these.
That's right.
Again, adopting the Chicago principles, but particularly adopting this notion of institutional neutrality so that they don't come out and, express as an institution support for Black Lives Matter or for, the decolonization movement or whatever you want to call it. Many people would welcome that. I wonder how far that goes, though, institutional neutrality. Let me give you just a couple of potential examples. Supposing there is a horrible attack on campus on Jews, or for that matter on Muslims, or whatever we want to talk about, and it's obviously hate-driven, it's obviously anti-Semitic. Is there not a kind of moral obligation on the university to come out and institutionally condemn anti-Semitism.
Are we talking about speech or actions? And those are very different things. But, we have a very broad tolerance for speech. It's really grounded in the First Amendment, and it doesn't differ much from it. Obviously, we're not going to tolerate harassment of a person. We're not going to tolerate threats against individuals. And if it's a set of threats that are directed at a group but appear to really be credible and so on, then we will act and we will deal with those. But, we have a very broad latitude, and that includes offensive speech.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul, but say Holocaust denial. Supposing you had, I think it's very unlikely, but supposing you had an academic, or much more likely, I think these days, a student who wrote a paper or gave a speech essentially denying the Holocaust. Would that be tolerated?
We really have a very broad latitude for free expression. And so, you can actually look and see in the last couple of years, there have been a number of examples of faculty or students who have said things that many people on the campus considered to be outrageous. In fact, one person who said some outrageous things, I'm not going to identify the person, but one person who managed to say a whole bunch of outrageous things and got people really riled up as a young person, subsequently in one of their blog posts said, I can't believe the university let me say those things.
Well, do you think he was testing the limits of free speech?
I don't know if he was testing the limits or if he was actually hoping to be disciplined so that then he could turn around and say, look, I'm a victim of being, a witch hunt against me because of my free expression. I don't know what it was. I mean, it's not for me to speculate. But he said some things that people didn't like very much. But the other people responded. They wrote back into the Maroon. They said, whatever. And they engaged in speech, and on we went. I mean, the university's still a very healthy place, and all the students are there, and they're doing their work, and they're learning, and there we go. Maybe that person has now reflected a little bit more on their kind of, let's say, provocateurship as having been kind of maybe even a failed strategy of, wanting to just say some outrageous things and then, hoping to get sanctioned. That's not a very good way of engaging inside a place that's truth-seeking. That's just kind of, not truth-seeking. And, we just let that stuff go by.
Forgive me for labouring this a bit, but say, and again, extreme hypothesis here, but it's not so extreme. Maybe one could think of contemporary examples which would apply to it. But say, German universities in the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power and were immediately implementing their, anti-Jewish programs, including, by the way, at universities, would institutional neutrality forbid them from coming out and condemning this? Or?
I have an obligation, not just, the option, but an obligation to defend the truth-seeking of the university, which would mean, to my mind, for example, that if something happened that threatened the future of free expression of the university or that threatened individuals, I have an obligation to make an exception to institutional neutrality, and I would do so without any hesitation. I will say, if we go through the history of the university, there have been only a few cases where presidents have done that. And, we established, I think you may recall, recently a forum for free inquiry and expression. We're about to have the 10th anniversary for it. And I believe it's a healthy thing for us to go back and look at all those exceptions and try to see, did the presidents get it right at those times when they did make exceptions or not? So, we have to be a place that's willing to go back and look and see, did we get things right in the past and so on. But I think, in answer to your question, if things start to happen which materially impact the ability of the university to function, the president has an obligation to step in and fight against those things. And I will certainly do so. But it's not regular, like I believe, Russia was justified in invading Ukraine, or something that some people would interpret as being really essentially a racist comment. But
so unclear, only if it affects the university directly.
That's right.
So I understand. So if a president...
It's functioning.
If an American president were elected and said, we don't want any Muslims going to university, we're going to ban Muslims from going to university...
That would be an enormous problem for us. There are enormously talented people from the Muslim world. There could be the next Fields medalist amongst them. We want them at our university.
So it's in your institutional interest to oppose that.
And I need to make that judgment, and then I have to live with that judgment with history. And that's why I'm saying I think, these are serious obligations. We only intervene in free expression when it affects the functioning of the university itself and its ability to be a place of truth-seeking. And that's not, I disagreed or I said something you found offensive.
But a broader example, which you say the president said, no more immigrants. We don't want to, these great universities are, universities for Americans. We don't want to be educating foreigners, especially when they go back and take all of the human capital that they've accumulated in their education back to their countries. So we don't want any foreigners. Would that be something that the university would speak out on and
So I'm going to be
its
careful here
neutrality?
because I don't want to speak about things that are hypotheticals, which who knows what world we're going to be in, and I should be careful because these are serious things. But I will say this, that we are a global university insofar as we want people who can think in new ways. We want to be the place of discovery, much as we have been for decades and decades. And if there's one thing I want to share with your listeners on this one is that the United States has the greatest economy in the world because it's an open country. And when we make open science and when we do those kinds of things, sure, there are places for us to do classified work, there are places for us to do those kinds of things, but universities are designed to be open places of contestation of ideas with the best talent in the world. We serve the American people that way our best. And trying to close them off, if you want to see the U.S. being prosperous, that doesn't feel like the way to go.
Good. You've made very strongly the case about how universities should go about in the pursuit of truth. So let's go into some of those areas where the pursuit of truth is
Can I
yielding.
Add one more thing?
Yes, please go on. Go one more.
One more. It's around my mind when I came in here. I just wanted to get it out this year because
Yeah.
I didn't say it in past years.
Yeah.
So I think that we depend not just, as we said, Chicago principles are gaining momentum inside the universities, but I would like also for us to think hard about other kinds of institutions. I'm very concerned about learned societies. Maybe you saw American Anthropological Association, American Historical Association. I'm very concerned about institutions like that taking political positions.
Right.
I believe they should be there to serve their members that have a broad range of points of view, and so they should adhere to the Chicago principles as well. And I believe the same way when we talk about things like scientific journals. I'm a scientist myself. Scientific journals should be places where we debate the science, where we really have vigorous debate about it, but they should not be places where, for example, some endorsing political candidates and things like that. I believe that violates the truth-seeking functions of those organizations. And so the Chicago principles could serve many other parts of society. Society needs to be able to rely on its truth-seeking organizations to seek truth.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Paul Alivisatos, President of the University of Chicago. We're talking about the state of free speech on university campuses, but also he's going to tell us about some of the fascinating new research that's been going on at the University of Chicago involving artificial intelligence and other aspects of academic work. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Paul Alivisatos, President of the University of Chicago, discussing the state of free expression on university campuses. One thing that obviously everybody is very, very focused on is just the astonishing advances that are being achieved in artificial intelligence.
Isn't it incredible?
It's just extraordinary. You know, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts more generally on the topic of artificial intelligence. Do please tell me where you think it's going. But one question I want to start off with on this is in terms of what it does for universities and teaching. Somebody said to me, a very successful young billionaire who runs an AI company, he had a very interesting phrase. He said, we're very close to an age now in human development where intelligence is a commodity and knowledge is a commodity. If that's the case, and you're...
We're going to duke it out here.
I can see from... Well, I'm not the one you should be duking it out with him. But I can see from your expression you don't think it is the case. But you know where the argument comes from.
Of course.
But how does a university... When I can call up... and I do know this is true myself. When I can go to AI platforms that can give me a very, very, very high-level undergraduate education in economics, right?
Yeah.
So how does AI integrate into the university? What is the role of the university in the age of AI? Give us your thoughts on that.
Knowledge is not finite. It's expanding all the time. And the new tools will expand the expansion. And I'm excited. As a creator of knowledge and a consumer of knowledge, I'm excited about the tools, but I'm not afraid of them. So what I would say to that is we're going to double down. You know, as you know, for our undergraduates, for example, we have a core curriculum. We believe in it deeply. We teach students to think like a humanist, like a social scientist, like a biological or physical scientist. We make sure they know some math. We study a civilization. They study a civilization. They learn to think. And I think a few years from now, what we will see, I mean, you know, it's going to be a process. It's going to evolve. But I think what will happen is one of the things we'll add to that is the ability to use the computational and statistical lens of thought. In other words, the underlying principles of AI. I think to be an educated person, you'll have to know and to have used those. So we'll probably probably expand ultimately. I'm now probably going to irritate some of my faculty who control this, not me. But I think over time what we'll see is that the core curriculum is going to expand to include those kinds of things. That's my opinion, that we should do that as a faculty member. So I think that's where it will head. But we want our students to be able to think, and their ability to think as humanists and social scientists will be every bit as important as their other kinds of abilities, and that they'll be really good at using these tools. We want them to be the best at not being subsumed by these tools, but being great at using them and building on them. And so for our students, they should not be afraid of this, and our faculty shouldn't be either.
But what is a human professor? And again, University of Chicago, indisputably one of the great universities in the world with some of the greatest academics in the world. But even at the University of Chicago, I'm guessing, forgive me for saying this, that there are professors who, what can they offer? What can a professor, assistant professor, or whatever you want to call, offer over, Professor ChatGPT? I mean, I'm talking about teaching here. We can talk a little bit about research too, obviously, which is different. But,
how to think? I mean,
we're not close to an artificial intelligence that will be able to do that too?
I think the ability to answer specific questions is getting better and better. Look, of course, I can't completely answer this, but my strong opinion is that the ability to be in engagement with other human beings is going to offer a much richer experience than anything that comes. We just went through a round of this. I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning of COVID, it was all about how, online education and so on and so forth. And then the marketplace spoke, and the students said, we want to be on campus because we learn from each other. Do I think that suddenly students who are 18, 19, 20, 22 are going to not want to be with each other as they're learning how to think? No, I don't think that. I think they're going to use these tools all the time, and those are going to make them better at it. And I think trying to curb that would be foolish, in my opinion.
I can see the benefit of human interaction. But let's again talk about pure research. Again, can you see a time when an AI could do the kind of research that would win a Nobel Prize, for example?
Well, let me give you the example of who did win a Nobel Prize this year, which was our 2017 PhD graduate, John Jumper, who was one of the leaders of the DeepMind team that did AlphaFold. And I think, let me give that example because it will allow to illustrate a little bit what the state of play is. Because, we have to be careful here with how much we're extrapolating. The AlphaFold took the protein structures, and remember, we knew proteins take, the DNA code is translated into an amino acid sequence. That amino acid sequence takes the information and folds it into a structure that can act chemically to execute things in the world. It translates the code into how to work in the chemical world and in the biological world. It makes a unit of production of some kind. And that we've known forever is incredibly important, forever meaning at least 6-7 decades. And we wanted to understand how those work. And so the structures were obtained over decades at the Department of Energy-funded synchrotrons at the national labs and other places. They obtained the protein structures of every protein. And then the DeepMind team could take that incredible data set and convert that into an understanding of how things fold, solving a problem that scientists had tried to solve for 50 years, overnight.
Okay.
So that's an example where an incredibly great data set created a great development. But the data set was specific and very tightly controlled. And I think those are getting more and more data sets, and they'll use those to answer important problems. If you ask me the question, are we suddenly going to have, imagine that he took all the information before Einstein.
Yeah.
Dennis Hassabis was saying this the other day, and I think it's a brilliant example. He took all the information from before Einstein's discovery of special and general relativity, and you had said, can you infer those? I don't think so. I don't see anything that looks like that. It's primarily interpolative. It doesn't extend beyond the range of those data sets so far. Look, it does great jobs with text. It does great jobs with all kinds of things. Let's see what happens. But before we make statements of very general intelligence, let's see the evidence of that, because I haven't seen it so far. And I think there's a ton of room of what to do with the tools within their range now.
I'm trying to understand, how close could we be, or are we ever going to get to the point where the algorithms and the data that they have enable these sophisticated AI platforms that can, you've given that example where they solve for those problems that no human had been able to do. Is that going to mean that we're going to see astonishing AI-generated advances in medical care, whether it's immunotherapy and
AI-assisted advances everywhere?
Yeah.
Human beings and AIs together are going to be far better than humans. I use my self-driving car all the time, but I'm on it like a hawk. Yeah. The combination of us drives much better than me. That's more the analogy that I would favor, is that I think we're going to see, although in driving case, it may actually
But isn't it just a matter of time before you won't need to supervise?
That's a
and
finite
put your hands
problem.
on
That's not discovering something new. That's something any 18-year-old can get into a car and learn how to drive in half an hour practically, right? So, I mean, it's not some great feat of intellectual development. Look, I don't know the answer to this, but I would say there is not yet any actual example of AIs creating a kind of knowledge that didn't exist before. Certainly, it's possible. Our brains do it. Our brains do it all the time, and they're physical objects in the world. So, of course, it's possible that that could occur. And, of course, when you think about our brains, they consume so much less energy than the AI tools. So, as they get better, who knows? But that hasn't happened yet. And I think that's a claim that should be tested very severely. It's not a casual claim. So far, what we see is an incredible opening of opportunity to learn humans and machines together much better than we could have before. It's exciting. It's big. It's going to change universities. It's going to change companies. It's going to change countries and economies. So it's big, but let's not go that next step without evidence.
But what about the ethics surrounding it? I'm sure you've looked into this a lot, and you've dealt with this a lot at Chicago. What are the rules that we should be trying, again, either as institutions like University of Chicago or more broadly as a society, we should be thinking about at least in terms of, because we're all familiar with these kind of Frankenstein monster view, which is held by some very serious people, including, Jeffrey Hinton, the Google guy, and others, that we, and that we have to grasp these things right now before it's too late. Elon Musk, I think, thinks the same. We have to impose some kind of regulatory structure before, frankly, the game's over. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I'm a little bit more, I do take Hinton or Musk, these are really incredible people. And so when they're saying things like that, we should pay very close attention. I don't mean to, naysay those kinds of things. And I do think that we want to educate our people, for example, to be thoughtful human beings that care about each other in the world and, are not trying to use technologies in ways that are terrible. And, we live in a very complicated world where some people do very bad things. So all that's true. Again, I haven't seen the evidence of it yet, and it's just such a high claim. I'd be cautious. But as I said, I think we should expose our students to the computational lens of thought for statistics and so on so that they can be knowledgeable about these tools. At the same time, that means we should continue to educate them to understand how to think as a human being in a broader way that takes into account ethics and things like that. That's why we teach them, for example, civilizations and other things like that. So, yes, but I wouldn't over-regulate too early either, because right now the prospects for creating new things are so wonderful. And if you use a kind of precautionary principle and say we're just going to kind of close things off until we know, first of all, we wouldn't know what specific challenges are going to emerge. Don't make regulation until you know that there's something to regulate. And to do it prospectively, there have been a couple of examples. I mean, for example, when CRISPR came out, I really admire what the CRISPR inventors, especially Jennifer Doudna and others, did, where they early on said this should not be used to do things related to human beings. There are things like that in the AI space, but, over-regulation too early could lead to lots of problems. We're just coming off an era where we see what happened when people want to control speech on the social media platforms, led to lots of problems. Let's move in response to problems.
Can you give us any examples of AI-assisted research, for example, that maybe is going on at Chicago?
It's everywhere. Oh, yeah. Let me give you three quick ones. We have recently had a team, Arjun Raman, brilliant students and faculty in our microbiome world, where they took genetic analysis of large numbers of microbiomes, and they were able to use those to decode the history of how microbes have fought against each other all through history, what kinds of molecules microbes have made to attack other kinds of microbes. And from that, they are able to infer peptide molecules which could act against the bacterial infections that can't be treated with conventional microbes. That's totally an AI-based project. Could not have been done without those kinds of tools. Requires massive genome analysis, requires cooperation of the university with other partners, not just in the university. It's an example of the changing world. A second one, some of our top people, economists and others, and our people at the Argonne National Lab are working to extend. I don't know if you saw DeepMind published recently, another blowout paper, my God, so wonderful, in Nature, the 15-day weather prediction for Europe. Don't know if you saw that. Incredible, uncanny. But that's not available for people in the developing world where they depend on the weather, whether it's going to demolish their crops or not. So we're developing an AI-based weather prediction that will be applied specifically to parts of the world where agricultural production is really key to avoiding starvation.
And these have much higher levels of accuracy than sort of traditional weather.
So it turns out people have tried to model the weather with a physical model, if the pressure changes here and so on, try to predict from physical equations what the weather's going to look like But now recently we've seen that just having tons of weather data over a long period of time and doing all the correlative statistical things that go on inside these AI models, they can make much better predictions of weather. So we're going to extend that to people who need that in the developing world. That's an example of a great project that's happening at the university. A third one will interest you. It's the example of Nightshade, Ben Zhao. He encountered some artists, a visual artist, whose work had been scarfed up into the data set for an AI. And she's such a successful artist, they said, we'll make it so that you could say, I'm making a hand drawing, please render it in the style of artist XYZ. And suddenly she lost all her income because everybody was able to create art that looked just like hers. Ben looked at that and said, how are we going to solve that problem? And he created a tool which modifies all of her future artworks in ways you would never see perceptibly, but makes it so it can't be ingested.
Almost like a kind of AI watermark kind of idea.
Like a watermark, and it protects her against it. So there you got three examples. Health, you've got people in the developing world, we're protecting the creative arts. Anywhere you go in the university, you see that. If we talk again next year, you will see that the university has gone even much farther and that these tools have become integrated into large parts of the university in deeper ways, and that we're not afraid of it.
All right. To conclude, Paul, it sounds as though you sound very optimistic about it. So I'm assuming, again, AI will clearly, obviously substitute for large amounts of activity that's work that's traditionally done by humans, including academics, right? I mean, we just talked about maybe not, maybe you disagree, but accepting your point about human interaction. But again, there's already the capability for an AI to teach interactively, by the way. I don't just mean in a passive way.
Yeah, I use them all the time. I learn all kinds of stuff that way.
Those things are presumably going to substitute for at least some of the activities that universities do.
Complementarity, though. Complementarity. So humans will do other things. And, it's not like when we stop doing one thing that we don't have other things to do. Remember, knowledge is not finite. There's more that we don't know than we do. We may be so impressed by what we do know, but remember, knowledge is always growing. It's not ended. And the opportunity is always there. Look at the explosion in the economy that's taking place right now. The economy can still grow. Productivity today is so much bigger than it was when the Industrial Revolution started, but it's taking an even bigger inflection point. In fact, I was just listening to Larry Summers and some others talking about how when codes write codes, it allows another inflection point in growth and economic opportunity. Let's focus on that. Yes, of course there are bad people in the world. Of course there's unethical things. But let's focus on also the immense opportunity that's coming, and don't feel like we're boxed in. The world has opportunity.
That is a wonderfully optimistic note from you, for me, and for our listeners. Paul Alivisatos, President of the University of Chicago. Once again, thank you very much for joining Free Expression.
It's a joy to be with you, Jerry. Thank you for welcoming me.
Well, that's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode of Free Expression. Thanks very much for joining us. In the meantime, have a great week, and speak to you then.